This tier list is a complete march into insanity, covering an insane almost 400 different decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! It covers everything from sporadic garbage that Konami spat out to the current TCG metagame. Breaking down these decks was a challenge, but to make it easier, I set out a few key rules. First, this is for the TCG side of the game, not the OCG or Master Duel formats of Yu-Gi-Oh! I had to pick a format to get a unified ban list and card pool. This also means that it's for the modern day format of Yu-Gi-Oh! Second, in order to easily categorize what is a deck, I've broken it mostly down into archetypes, but I'm also including plenty of slots for unique strategies like Rock Stun, Nurse Burn, and Chain Burn. This makes it mostly easy to recognize what each deck is at a glance from the tier list. But if you're confused, you can check my website or a pinned comment for a written out list of decks, plus links to the deck profiles I'll be showing throughout the video. It normally would be in the description, but it's just too long. The archetype system also means that decks are ranked as their strongest version or variant, while still using that archetype or strategy as its core. For example, Lightsworns could be counted as a Shizu Tearlament Lightsworn, since that deck is the strongest build of Lightsworns, but a Shizu Tearlament will be ranked higher as a deck on their own, since they're better at using different engines or just being used together. Lastly, let me explain the tiers. There were 11 tiers spread out between 10 and 0. A ranking of 10 is game warping, traditionally what is known as a tier 0 deck. A ranking of 0 means it's literally not a functional deck. Like, this is just a collection of cards Konami printed as pack filler or just never finished. The 3 to 5 range is roughly casual decks, and the 6 to 9 range is roughly where the competitive game takes place. If you're asking why I didn't use a traditional 0 down ranking system, or an F through S system, it's because it stopped making sense to do that around deck 200. Since there ended up being too many decks for each tier, it made the entire tier list lose proper meaning. It helps to think of my system as a how good is this deck out of 10. I'll get more into what each tier means as we go along. And drumroll please, for the worst deck in the format, it's our favorite modern art exhibit, ITSU. A deck comprising of 4 fairy monsters with the unfortunate gimmick of trying to equip themselves to each other. Unfortunately for them, their best equip is a level 10, and it has to equip to a level 5 normal monster. What's more, all these monsters get for being equipped is an attack gain and piercing damage. Surprisingly though, we're not completely out of luck when playing this deck. Fairy support such as Celestial Transformation and Valhalla Hall of the Fallen actually let us special summon out mistakes. Outside of that, the deck is doing everything else the hard way. The deck mostly has to rely on battle phase searchers and generic draw power for consistency. And there's really no end goal to this deck, as just equipping one Koitsu alone isn't near enough to OTK. I want to say that God left them unfinished, but I think God knew what he was doing when bringing Itsu into the world. It was a warning never to let Jeff at Konami design cards again. Pikeru and Curran are a prototype level monster archetype that probably would excite that weird guy at your locals. Pikeru and Curran have a minor burn and life gain effect respectively, that triggers on each of your standby phases. These monsters with 1200 attack can evolve into a still terrible, jazzed up version of themselves if they can beat an opponent's level 5 monster during the battle phase. Now the equip spell does give 800 attack and summons the evolved version from the deck, but that doesn't fix anything about the strategy. It's funny because with all the equip support in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, the deck is consistent at being garbage. Only held up really by a vague notion of generic spellcaster support. For context about how terrible these effect monsters are, it would take 3 whole turns to kill an opponent using Princess Curran's effect if the opponent had a full board. Receiving 3 turns to burn an opponent to death is not a good trade for doing an entire anime's worth of character development in one duel. This isn't even worth a deck list. Ocean's Keeper is a weird line of fish monsters with a unique gimmick of special summoning themselves out by tributing Ocean's Keeper. The most important effect this deck has is that Thousand Eyes Jellyfish forces an opponent to play with their hand revealed. So, that gives us 2 directions to take this awful strategy. We can play it with generic water and shark support for a terrible version of Umi or shark control. Now, if we're a Chad, we can combo the jellyfish with cards that require us to guess cards in our opponent's hand. Cards like DD Designator, Mind Crush, and Prohibition let us force out an absurd amount of cards from the opponent's hand. The deck list I'm showing here is more of a concept than a polished deck. It's got a ton of great ideas that actually do something with this deck's terrible gimmick. If this deck was optimized, someone could get some killer replays that might make people think the deck was actually good. Iron Chain is an unfinished thought from Konami. It's more of a collection of miscellaneous effects than an actual deck. What is there is split between bad milling effects and bad burn effects. The only thing holding up this deck is that Iron Chain Repairman can revive an Iron Chain monster from grave. So I guess this should be played as a graveyard deck with, I don't know, fucking Ishizus? Konami didn't put much thought into this deck, so neither did I. Bouncers are a prototype Hazy Flame, or in other words, an even worse rank 6 engine. They have one decent free normal summon level 6, and a good boss monster that the deck struggles to make. All in all, a very slow and boring deck. While there's a good trap for protection, and a monster with okay recursion, the deck ultimately lacks any ability to use its pieces. Really, this deck is only this high because its boss monster is legitimately good. Vampiric Orchis and Desdindle are a weird plant union monster token generator. This deck's existence generally shocked me, as who would have even thought that it existed? Well, someone did, as this deck does have synergy with other plant-based strategies, such as Rose Dragon, and with generic cards such as Rose Girl. This deck list I'm showing you, despite containing banned cards, is the only example of acknowledgement this deck has ever received online. Not only that, this list is absurdly based, because I think the point is to use Queen of Thorns in combination with Seed Cannons to hard limit the number of summons an opponent can attempt. Now that I think about it, if we used this gimmick with a better plant engine, we could probably make a serious deck. At least one competent enough to send the table 500. Also, I guess you could call Orchis a rank 4 engine. Reactors are a terrible set of monsters with the bad gimmick of burning the opponent once per turn when they play a certain type of card. It's just not at all a usable effect. But the deck also contains 2 boss monsters. Flying Fortress Skyfire, which is a minimally better version of Summon Reactor with an absurd summon requirement, and then Dark Flat Top, who is an amazing enabler for the deck, that the deck struggles to make. What Reactors have going for them is that they are machine-type monsters and not summon restricted outside of the boss monsters, unlike the lower decks. There have been many attempts to make this deck work, from Machina to Symphonics to Gadgets. None of it actually really works for the deck, but people will keep trying. At least with Reactors, you'll always win in time. The bad news is, you'll never actually make it the time with how terrible the deck is. Majestic Mechs are a series of mostly high-level monsters that let you summon them slightly easier at the cost of destroying themselves, on in phase, or harming you at the end of the turn. Luckily with the speed of modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, this isn't as much of a problem as it used to be, since we can immediately throw out Pyrotech Mech Shinru into a spicy rank 8 or a generic Link monster. It's still not a good engine, or even a good tech, since all the mechs take your normal summon, are actively worse than vanilla monsters on the board, and have inconsistent and hard to use typing. It just makes this archetype hard to use in any sort of deck. Most people will default to using this deck's fairy monsters, and comboing it with Valhalla, Hall of the Fallen, to try to get these monsters to stick. But there's never any success to this deck strategy, as it's too slow, and certainly much too costly. Monk Fighter is a based old school archetype, centered around a single monster during the battle phase. Despite any of this deck's monsters and poor attack values, this deck comes packaged with great removal. What's even more funny is this deck's singular trap card, Lone Wolf. This card turns your monk into a janky towers monster. The strategy is of course way too slow, dependent on the battle phase, to do anything, and just inconsistent. That is until you remember that Monk Fighter is a rock-type monster. So yes, you can use an Adamancipator engine to play Monk Turbo. This isn't good, but I am legally allowed to do it, and at least it makes Interior Beast easily. If you like this deck list and all the hard work I've put into this video, make sure to subscribe. I need to get those numbers up so people respect my opinions. Plus, when you get through the 2 hours this video is, and realize it's not done yet, you'll be subscribed for the next part. Anyway, back to the tier list. Guardians, not Gate Guardians, are an early archetype with the unique gimmick of needing specific equip spells to summon themselves. Outside of Guardian Eatos, who is a decent free special summon, this deck doesn't have any great effects. There's not a good way to get the equip spells onto the field first, as it's required by the deck. Also, Butterfly Dagger Elma, one of the required equip spells, is banned due to its use in infinite loops, making the deck actually unplayable at full power. Theoretically, these loops are the only way to play the deck, since Guardian Seal does not have a once per turn clause on its removal effect. But due to needing 3 specific cards for any play, this deck is a consistency nightmare. Even anime fans can't get this deck to work. Perhaps the worst translation of an anime archetype is Water Dragon. So this deck has an unfortunate gimmick. You're trying to get elements onto the field, and then use Chemistry or an analogous spell card to summon Water Dragon Cluster. It's a mediocre boss monster that can turn into 2 level 8s for a rank 8. This specific strategy takes 4 cards in hand, several of which do not have usable effects, and the best monster is level 5. Inconsistent would be a kind description. So, what can we do to play this deck? Well, since they're dinosaurs, we can play a basic dinosaur engine to attempt to put the pieces onto the field, either through miscellaneous source or from one of the baby dinosaurs. Perhaps we can also abuse generic water support to attempt to make the engine usable. By the way, the tagline for this deck list I found is "Chemistry so good, you'll come uncontrollably." Now this is real, and this isn't a joke, but I guess it's good chemistry. Did you know that Castel the Skyblaster Musketeer and the Magic Normal monster accidentally ended up in one of the worst archetypes ever? So Skyblasters are a thing that exist because the broken token generator card Phantom Skyblaster works with Skyblaster cards. This was supposed to be only for a burn effect with its own tokens, but it does technically work with the other 2 cards, even if what it does is just burn for 1800 max. Phantom Skyblaster is a good card, as are Castel and Clavkeys, but they don't make a coherent deck and barely count as one. This should be proof of how thorough I'm going with this list. The deck is only as high as it is, thanks to the power of Phantom Skyblaster's first effect, even if he is limited. Here's another archetype that no one has ever heard of. It's Zera. Warrior of Zera can either evolve into an Archlord form or a villain form, each getting value from a different field spell. The Archlord form is terrible, but there's some spice from the villain form. Misero Deville lets you tribute 1 Warrior of Zera while Pandemonium's on the field to special summon himself. On his summon, he forces our opponent to discard 3 random cards. Luckily for Zera, this is a pretty good end goal, and because of Pandemonium, the deck has synergy with Archfiends. It's just at the end of the day, this deck is just too inconsistent, too slow, and just too disruptible to get anything off. Even with modern support like Unexpected Die, Magical Contract Door, and all the new agent support, which this deck has options for, by the way. I want a good deck list for Zera, and I really haven't been able to crack it. Someone please solve this deck and send me a deck list in my Discord. Materiactor are a weird unfinished archetype. What they have so far is good, but what they have is 2 monster cards and a spell card that I don't fully comprehend, but could potentially be loopable. It's just a free rank 3 right now in a very, very specific deck. But while that's surprisingly not awful, it's not good either. I don't know why they had to pull Materiactors from sets, but not something like Zodiac or Shizu. I am terrified of what Konami meant by this. The deck was released in 2021 and just stands out being this new and this low on the tier list. Dark Scorpions were last playable in GOAT format as a very, very weak rogue option, and even then they were never great. They are an attack-based deck with low attack values. Another issue is half of the effects are focused on milling the opponent, just enough cards to be helpful for them. Donzalug's discard effect is good, but good luck resolving it in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Mustering the Dark Scorpions has the same problems of every other seemingly good combo in this tier. It's just too inconsistent. Here's a good deck list I found using Inferno Knights to pretend this deck is still playable. Honestly, this is more of an indictment of modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Card design than a Dark Scorpion deck list. But who knows, maybe one of you in the audience can make something worthwhile with this concept. Sphinx are a bad anime movie archetype with the bad gimmick of special summoning themselves if you control their bad trap card, Pyramid of Light. Luckily, through years of accidental support, Sphinx has slowly become slightly less unplayable. At a most simple level, these cards are beast type, meaning they can be combined with Tri-Brigade for actual disruptions. Consistency-wise, we can use the Numlaria archetype to search for our 2 main Sphinxes. You see, Numlaria Dream Tower searches for any 2 level 10 beast monsters, meaning there's actual consistency to this deck's goals. Lastly, I've seen this deck often played with a Melfi engine to stall until we can get out our Sphinx monsters. It's a weirdly consistent thing I've seen from different people, so maybe there's something to it I'm not seeing. In any case, some combination of these strategies should give you an illusion of playability. Mokey Mokey surprised me with how much it can do with so little. But right now, Mokey Mokey is a level 1 normal spam deck with some funny OTK options. Basically, the strategy works by using cards like Valhalla Hall of the Fallen and Unexpected Die to swarm the field. Then it uses its continuous spell, Mokey Mokey Smackdown, to set its monster's attack to 3000 after crashing Mokey Mokey King. This strategy is very funny, but it's not good, it's inconsistent, loses to any interaction, and slow. It gets weirdly more consistent with Mokey Mokey Adrift, but don't expect to win any major tournaments with this deck. Here's an excellent deck list that actually can semi-consistently attempt its gimmick, and that's surprisingly hard to find for these anime decks. Helios is a funny archetype based around the guy you can summon off of Macro Cosmos. Luckily, unlike some other engines, we're not solely dependent on Macro Cosmos for summoning out Helios. We have 3 levels of Helios, each needing to tribute a previous level, and slowly gaining more attack per banished card, and some multiple attacks. At its highest level, it's better Grand Maju. Speaking of which, we can blend this strategy together with Grand Maju, using engines like Golden Castle, Pot of Extravagance or Desires, and Eater of Millions. These should let us get consistent numbers on Helios. Macrocosmos being limited, of course, hurts this deck a lot, and honestly, you should just play Grand Maju. Goblins are a weird attack-based, random bullshit go deck. Years of cards happening to be themed around goblins have given this deck absurd amounts of utility for an unplayable mess. Scrounging Goblins gives the deck a search for any goblin card. This can be anything from Upstart Goblin for a draw, Robin Goblin for hand patrol, and Goblinberg for field swarming. Unfortunately, outside of a few notable goblins, most have low attack values despite being focused on the battle phase. The deck has many other gimmicks such as making Goblin King a gigantic beatstick or using Goblin of Greed to turn off discard effects. Yeah, that's right, this bottom of the tier list deck can turn off hand traps despite not benefiting from this at all. So yeah, you have a lot of varied options. They're not good options, but you have a lot of them. Inmato are a weird one that might be a bit hard to figure out why they're this high on the tier list. I'll give you a second to figure it out. That's right! They're level 2! So what should be a terrible gimmick now has an amazing line of negates to fall back on. What Inmatos do is summon 2 Inmatos from the deck once Cherry Inmato is destroyed, giving access to a rank 2, rank 3, or a link 2 monster. Honestly, this deck is just worse Umbral Horrors despite the synergy with Sprite. The Inmato line of combos is just too slow and incorrect. DD, not DDD, are a weird one. They're less of an archetype and more of a series of miscellaneous cards trying to tell a story. This means that DDDs don't really have synergy. It also doesn't help that Return from a Different Dimension is banned, leaving this archetype to lack a proper end goal. What the deck does have is a variety of miscellaneous monsters that banish cards everywhere. DD Warrior and DD Warrior Lady were great cards almost 20 years ago. But in today's game, they've been power crept out almost for decades. And more importantly, the DDD line of cards don't form a strategy and don't synergize with any outside deck, if we're not counting generic banish cards, forcing players to build the deck as a weird stun strategy that auto loses if the opponent doesn't care about banishing or can remove 2 cards from the field. Phantom Beast are a miscellaneous set of cards roughly synergizing around graveyard effects and the anime classic Gazelle the King of Mythical Beasts. It's got some graveyard protection and attack gain, but that's really all it brings to the table on its own. It is a Beast Warrior type deck, so it works with the Fire Formation cards as well as Tri-Brigade. This, of course, is all before the new wave of support releasing in Duelist Nexus, when the deck becomes a relatively strong fusion engine. As it is now though, this deck doesn't really do anything outside of being a good type for other engines. Spiders are a weirder, older deck of generic insects that have the unique gimmick of setting monsters to defense position for value. While that is an extremely abysmal mechanic, they do have a lot more going for them than at first glance. They have the bare minimum of special summons. They can steal or tribute the opponent's defense position cards. They can spam out monsters with Block Spider, and they have removal thanks to Relinquished Spider. More so than that, Digital Bugs, Battle Wasp, and Bee Troopers all go a long way to making this awful strategy possible. Is it good? No, it's way too slow for that. But it is like a thing that can work mostly on its own that puts it higher than most decks in Tier 0. The Wicked Gods are manga-exclusive evil versions of the Egyptian god cards. On one hand, they do have much better effects than the original Egyptian gods, especially the Wicked Avatar, who turns off an opponent's spell and trap cards for 2 of their turns as a lingering effect, and it has a built-in Moon Mirror Shield effect. But on the other hand, these cards don't share the divine typing, meaning they lack the ability to use almost any of the new Egyptian god support, leaving this deck almost without a crutch. There are, however, 2 ways to fix this. The Wicked Gods do somewhat work with the Sacred Beast support, even if more than half of these effects don't do anything specifically for them. This deck also works quite well with Monarchs and the new Attribute support. Domain plus Monarchs Erupt plus the Wicked Avatar is unironically absurdly hard for most decks to out. Good luck doing this though, as the consistency issues of regular Monarchs only get unplayably worse with this build. Oh yeah, and an opponent can just effect veil their Wicked Avatar's effect on its summon. Gradius is a series of 2 direct monsters and some nebulous support based around the classic Konami arcade games. The direct support for this deck is just about getting a free special summon of Gradius option if the player controls Gradius. The other technically not Gradius support focuses around some more or less decent effects if they destroy an opponent's monster by battle. The deck is held up by the card's Unexpected Die, combined with the very good pre-existing machine support in Yugioh. Between Gold and Silver Gadget, Limiter Removal, and of course Gear Gigant X, there's a lot this deck can do. Here's a more solid list that did cut out the classic Gradius cards, so technically it doesn't count as a Gradius deck for this tier list. However, this is probably the only remotely playable list you're gonna see for this deck, so I'm recommending you to try it. Here we are at tier 1, or in the unplayable category of Yu-Gi-Oh! It might not seem like much, but these decks do play noticeably better than tier 0 decks, and noticeably worse than tier 2 decks. Most people would never notice the difference between pieces of shit, but I try my best. Oh yeah, and one more thing before we continue. I'm sure you've noticed by now that modern generic support engines like Sprite, Tri-Brigade, and Despia have seriously inflated the playability of these lower decks. It makes it significantly harder to tier the lower decks, since now I have to ask the question if bad decks legitimately add anything, or it's just a technically playable engine. You'll more or less get an answer for that based on where in the tier list a deck is placed. Battleguard are a high-level warrior spam deck, held together by two very absurdly good pieces of generic support that happen to share a theme. Basically, Battleguards get to play around the card feasted level 5 to special summon two basic Battleguards from the hand, which only really have a small amount of attack. The deck can also use Battleguard King for a really not terrible OTK enabler. What makes this deck better than our previous decks is Battleguard Cadet, which not only searches Feast to the level 5, but it special summons Battleguard King for free. This deck also works extremely well with the Star Warrior archetype, a deck of level 5 warrior monsters, who special summon themselves more easily. However, in a more Battleguard focused build, there's not really any consistency in getting to our end goal, since we have to run so many hard to use monsters. Honestly, this deck shouldn't work, but Battleguards have a stupid anime-style resilience to try and beat the opponent to death, despite literally everything going against it. Horus is one of the better level up lines. While typically this doesn't quite make it into the more general builds, it does have enough gas to make it functional on its own. Horus level 8 is a non-once per turn spell negate. If Naturia Beast can get Naturias on the ban list, then Horus Dragon level 8 can sneak this deck into tier 1. Also, Horus has a monster to give it targeting protection, even if it's not consistent to run. In order to play the deck, there are several options we can go for. If we want to make Horus consistently, we can play a level-focused deck. This will not only let us search the Horus line, but also efficiently cheese through the levels into our boss monster. The deck list I'm showing for this section has a great breakdown of combos I'd recommend looking at. If this isn't a playstyle you like, this deck also works great with generic dragon support, even if it is technically slower. Lycanthrope is an old ritual monster strategy with the unique gimmick of burning for each normal monster in the graveyard after it inflicts battle damage. Yes, the strategy is ridiculously slow, bricky and dated, but it is still a valid strategy with enough close support to make it function, which is something that's a lot harder to say about those tier 0 decks. Thanks to all of the normal monster support, he's very easy to set up for, and thanks to pre-preparation of rights and all the generic ritual support, Lycanthrope is actually searchable. You could attempt to optimize this strategy or do something decent, but my personal recommendation for this deck is to build it as a Heart of the Underdog, Wombo Combo OTK deck, like the kind that runs 25 monsters and is bad. Des Frog is an unfortunate offshoot of Frogs. The gimmick is tribute summoning for Des Frog to summon out more Des Frogs from the deck. The problem is, this deck needs the specific card Tadpole in Graveyard, making this deck significantly more inconsistent. A bigger issue with this deck is how two cards for the strategy are on the ban list, Ronin Tonin and Substitute. These would make a more playable engine, but right now it's just a mess. Luckily, the deck does have some removal options and does synergize with generic water support, so it's more near the top of the trash can than at the bottom. Crashbug are a bad archetype that has retroactively turned into a very below average rank 3 deck. Basically, each of Crashbug X, Y, and Z let you special summon another one from deck when you normal summon them, but only if you already control another Crashbug. These are all specific, so it's going to be hard to use without bricking. Luckily, through years of level 3 support, and through Phantom Knights getting a ton of support over the years, we can make something out of this once unusable deck. It's still really bad, and having to normal summon the Crashbugs make this quite a bit of a pain. Here I resorted to banishing them with Allure of Darkness, and getting them with Leviair, so I would have a free normal summon open for Crashbug effects. Summoners are a weird little normal monster synergy engine released near the beginning of Arc V. It's got several search options for normal monsters, and it can be used as an easy special summon. Unfortunately, this deck's jobs are better done through generic support, such as Unexpected Die and Summoner's Art. Luckily, this deck can abuse the field spell Empowerment and Dragonox the Empowered Warrior for free field setup in the right deck. Honestly though, this engine is just so boring and so power crept, it's hard to say anything about it. We're still in those tiers where there's not a chance these decks can play around hand traps, and this engine right here is certainly no exception. Most of the deck list I see trying to use Empowered attempt to find some sort of plus for all the discarding the deck does. It's why Dangers get ran so frequently alongside the engine, even though it's not a normal monster-based deck. Personally, I think we might be able to make something work by combining it with a very scuffed Magic Key list. Potan are an interesting level 1 Synchro engine that just unfortunately lacks enough starters to make it viable. Red Potan special summons a level 1 Potan from deck when it is on field and witnesses a Synchro summon. Now the question of how you're going to get Red Potan on the field and still Synchro summon is a good question. Unfortunately, the other Potan monsters don't do anything, so it's kind of a struggle. It's a cool idea that just needs a few more monsters to really work properly. Even with all of the level 1 searchers in the game, like 1 for 1 and We're Off Now, it's just not enough. Gandora is a cool series of dragon monsters that destroy every card on the field. One of these dragons is an FTK enabler, since it burns equal to the highest attack card destroyed. Outside of niche uses and some sort of Dragon Link build, we can turn to our friend Grandmaju and its support for the most successful build of this deck. This list here is using some OCG only support, which isn't counted for the tier list, but you casual players who would like this kind of deck should go nuts. The biggest issue overall is mostly just how hard it can be to get Gandora out on the field to use his effect repeatedly, especially going second when our opponent might have something we want to blow up. Destiny Board is a bad anime deck with the ridiculous gimmick of needing to put 4 spell cards and 1 continuous trap onto the field to immediately win the game. These spells can only be placed by the effect of 2 specific trap cards that either have to destroy themselves to place 1, or can only do it once per turn during the end phase. Surprisingly, a bigger problem is that the main Destiny Board states that if any of the letters leave the field, all of the letters self-destruct. This makes Destiny Board a somehow worse version of Final Countdown. Much too many things have to go right for this deck to work, and with Mystic Mine banned, there's less gas than ever. Don't forget that this deck needs all of their open spell and trap zones, so floodgates can get very hard to use. The deck's field spell Dark Sanctuary does add a lot of protection, however it doesn't do that much to fix the speed or even vulnerability of the deck, since the field spell itself is vulnerable. All in all, this is an anime deck for glue eaters. Have you ever looked at Secret Village of the Spellcasters and thought that it was too easy and too good? Well, that's where Sealmaster Meisei comes in. By controlling Sealmaster Meisei and an unsearchable trap card, we can negate all spell effects on the field. Meisei also has a continuous spell that negates all traps on the field. This is a really good effect, even if it's inconsistent as hell. Outside of generic spellcaster support and unexpected die, we're gonna have to turn to some extremes to make this gimmick work. Because I'm bad, I'm running this with spellbooks, half because it's a great joke, and half because I'm the joke. It's very, very consistent, and can throw out Meisei plus Jowgen with some consistency. Just try to ignore the fact that Meisei negates your own spell cards as well. Celtic Guardians are a cool little warrior draw engine that draws cards for each Celtic Guard card you have on field when their main monster does battle damage. Decent attack value, free special summoning, and simple draws put this deck way above the lower decks here. The big issue is that this is a 4-card archetype, 2 of which are basically normal monsters. One is a flip searcher, and only the last one is really cared about. Although it should be mentioned that the main Celtic Guardian is a Noble Arms card, meaning he can be searched off of Noble Knight cards like Lost Lin or Augear. This deck does have potential for being a confusing tech in niche warrior decks. Pre-new support Earthbound Immortals are a collection of dated boss monsters that do not play nice with each other. It's all payoff and no setup, requiring other engines and specifically field spells to make it work. However, it does have some game-ending boss monsters, one that can wipe the opponent's board and then burn for massive damage, and one that does hand shuffling. Basically, this deck needs to piggyback off some other engine to set this up. I recommend Monarchs, but this piggybacking often means that the deck spell and trap lineup end up too inconsistent to use. All of this forces the deck into a really low spot on the tier list, not to mention the best effects like Raska are vulnerable to hand traps like Imperm. At least this is all before the newest wave of support. The support is good, even if it doesn't really need the old boss monsters. No, this isn't just a casual build of super heavy samurai, it's a full-on bad decision. Defense OTK is a janky strategy that involves running through several trap cards like Rise to Full Height, Cross Counter, and D2 Shield to OTK your opponent when they attack into your monster. This strategy is stupidly straightforward and surprisingly consistent, since it's so simple. Here's some advice to pulling this off in an actual game. You gotta fake it as if you've horribly bricked, like, ah shit, set pass I guess. You might get one guy to take enough pity on you so you can ruin his existence. The problem, of course, is that once an opponent realizes what you're doing, it will never work again. And unlike some other gimmick strategies on this list, you don't have the ability to forcibly trigger your win con. An opponent has to die willingly, and this isn't a My Chemical Romance concert. I think perhaps we can make a more aggressive list by combining into Super Heavy Samurai. That way we could actually kill our opponent while still getting value from our trap cards. But whether or not that counts as a defense OTK deck is up to you. Arcana Force are a deck about coin flips. Flip a coin. If heads, get a mediocre plus effect. If tails, lose the game outright. These monsters are inconsistent to use by design. Remember, in the anime, these had to be used with cheating to work. I suggest you do the same. There are two good things going for this deck, however. The deck's field spell, Light Barrier, lets the player control the coin flips of their monsters, but only if they can win a coin flip on the standby phase. The second good card, Arcana Force the World, lets us use a coin flip to attempt to skip an opponent's turn. It does require 4 monsters total to use, and a coin flip, but this is in fact an absurdly powerful effect. It can be cheated out with Valhalla Hall of the Fallen, but these two good cards can't carry an otherwise bad deck that struggles to output a remotely decent board. Even with the new OCG support, which lets the deck have another method of searching its field spell, the problems remain that the deck is still unplayably bad, even if slightly better. This one might confuse you a little. By technicality alone, Nightmare are a deck on the tier list, even if by nature they are an extra deck engine and have 2 cards on the ban list. Of course, this deck is only so low because none of the cards really do much outside of being generic extra deck pieces, or, in Ibli's case, a free way to lock out the opponent. Overall, it's not a great deck, even if the cards themselves are generally good. Dust-ons are so weird. The goal is to flood your opponent's board with dust-ons to lock out the opponent's options. At a most basic level, this gets screwed over by Link Summoning, since the cards only protect for pre-Arc V mechanics. The deck's other main option, Stardust On, is a solid lock, but it can't hit big enough numbers to be effective consistently. This deck does have a strategy, and plays nicely with generic support, such as Small World, Jack in the Hand, and Wear Off Now. It's still very rough, but it's not as out of it as you'd first think. The deck can also abuse funny text like Exchange to give your opponent dust-ons for no reason. I would still probably avoid playing this deck even at a casual level. While it's technically stronger than like Defense OTK, it's way more frustrating to play, and it's certainly a much less funny joke. It's time for my favorite bad deck in the game, Huge Revolution. By setting up 3 specific normal monsters on the field and activating the normal trap card Huge Revolution on our turn, we can ruin our opponent's everything, firmly uniting the unwashed masses of people into an unplayable strategy. This strategy can be set up through the use of Dark Dorito and Enchanted Fitting Room, 2 cards that stack the top of the deck and summon normal monsters off the top of the deck respectively. Outside of this, we can use generic normal monster support like Unexpected Die and Treasure Panda to attempt to set up the board. This is still a titanic ask, and it almost certainly won't work, but for the sake of the communist revolution, you still have to try. I just hope it works out better for you than it did for the people running about in the lore. Butter Spy, also known as Papillon, are a really generic rank 4 spam deck, split between 2 types, Warrior and Insect. This deck struggles to find any sort of identity. Basically, the deck gets a free special summon with the summon of a normal monster, and the deck has an insect link that revives an insect monster. Because of the contradiction in typing, this deck's playability is massively called into question. Here's a weird fact though, the Adventure Engine has a card with Papillon in the name, and doesn't remotely work with the previous Papillon support, and it seems to be more so a coincidence, attempting to tie together old lore more than anything else. Mist Valley are a random collection of wind-type cards, with the unfortunate gimmick of returning cards you control to the hand and getting destroyed by battle. This archetype is known mostly for its boss monster, Mist Valley Apex Avian, and its Omni Negate. More so, by getting both Apex Avian and Mist Valley Thunderbird out on the field at the same time, it creates an infinite negate loop. Despite how nuts this might seem, it doesn't save the deck. Ever since the Morgue Bird of Sovereignty is banned, and Divine Wind of Mist Valley is limited, absolutely killing any chance of competitive relevancy for this deck. If we're still gonna try and play Mist Valley, we can combine it with a number of wind strategies to juice the engine. Some Morgue, Symphonic Warriors, Speedroids, and, well, anything that starts with the letter S should work. This list I'm showing only barely counts as a Mist Valley deck, but I included it because it was originally built using banned cards. But because it's so old, the ban list changed, so now it's illegal again. Plus, it has like every major tech you can throw into the engine as a one-of, so it should inspire some actually good deck building from y'all. Umbral Horribles are a slow rank 4 strategy. Their main monster, Umbral Horror Uniform, requires us to suicide into an opponent's monster to get 2 free special summons. The deck's best special summon, Umbral Horror Ghost, is level 2 despite mostly being based around level 4s. Surprisingly, it's not actually the worst engine for free XYZs, especially when combined with generic rank 4 spam options. The real fun of this engine is attempting to go for rank up XYZ plays. A cruel twist of fate, since this engine is not equipped for this terrible strategy. C104 Umbral Horror Masquerade is a monster negate that also halves our opponent's life points and then forces a discard from their hand. Unfortunately, this monster needs 3 materials and a rank up spell to summon. All in all, we have a crazy good boss monster for a forgotten anime deck. XYZ Djinns, not to be confused with Ritual Djinns, are a series of early XYZ monsters that are roughly based around OTKing the opponent. These 3 monsters create an extremely inefficient line to OTK the opponent. However, it is a consistent line to OTK, being able to be used in whatever rank 3 spam engine happens to need an OTK. Not to mention, Humming the Key Djinn sets up really well for a Utopic Future and Utopic Draco. Similar to a lot of other engines around this tier, it's not bad per se, but it is largely outclassed and largely pointless in today's metagame. Watts are a battle phase control-ish deck. They really haven't aged too well. A majority of the deck's cards either require attacking directly or require an opponent to destroy your cards. The deck's 2 competent plays are Watt Train, which lets us search a ton of Watt monsters and then swarm with them during a later turn, but the second and much more fun play is to use 2 Watt Hoppers to prevent an opponent from attacking at all. This hasn't been remotely viable since 2011, but this hasn't stopped Watt players from making the most out of their garbage. Watts actually have topped last year in the OCG during Tearlament format. What the fuck? I'm sorry, I'd like to apologize for that pun. I'm reading the script and clearly I was on drugs. Let me explain how it works. Watch Your Aft is actually useful in a weird anti-meta tech that can lock the opponent out in a specific format, where effects have to trigger for an opponent to use their board, letting us safely deconstruct an opponent's field. This doesn't really count as a Watt deck, since it's clearly just a Kashtira deck with a rank 4 engine, but it goes to show you how even bad cards can sometimes find great uses. Have you ever wanted to win the game by attacking with the 0 attack monster into Blue Eyes White Dragon and taking 3000 damage? No, you say rationally. And I respond with, but that's the incredibly specific action required by Inferno Tempest and all of its decks. By taking 3000 damage in one attack, we can banish every monster in both players' decks and graveyard. Resolving this, of course, not only stops most decks from being able to play the game, but it also enables combos from our own deck. Gaudi, Nemesis, Shiranui, Mutant, and hell, we can just abuse Necroface for a cheap deck out. So how can we go about this? With Monon support, we have Kaijus to put a 3300 attack monster onto the opponent's field. We just have left arm offering. And lastly, in the main deck, we can run whatever bullshit combo we want. Just a reminder, an opponent who knows you're playing Inferno Tempest will never let you resolve it. It's got the same problems as Defense OTK, albeit slightly more mitigated. This may sneak in a game by being cheeky, but it can't really succeed on a casual level once an opponent knows the gimmick. Kei OTK is a super dated OTK deck that's all about spamming equips onto the card Armed Samurai, Kei for a quick OTK. Surprisingly, this deck has gotten infinitely more consistent thanks to the Fire Warrior engine and Isolde. We can also combine this with Konami releasing some very powerful equip spells under the radar. This deck will be getting massively better with the release of even more Noble Knight support in coming sets. However, right now, this deck still has trouble getting enough gas in hand and loses to, well, most forms of removal. You ever wonder why ABC decks never run the other alphabet letters, despite them getting years and years of legacy support, long after ABC's just got their structure deck? Well, it's because they're terrible. You're more or less going to be performing contact fusions with monsters from 2005. At the end of the day, no amount of legacy support is going to fix that without changing the deck from the ground up, which is what ABC's kinda did. It's especially a problem since the fusion monsters we have don't have modern or good effects. We can try to fix this with generic Union support, like Union Hanger or Union Diver, machine support like Gadgets or Ojamas, which Konami has been random enough to make synergize with the deck. This deck's dedicated support, like XYZ Combine and Unauthorized Reactivation, do actually give the deck some pressure, but it's not enough to make this Brick City get out of Tier 1. Alright, so that's the end of Part 1. As you can probably guess by now, this video was also supposed to cover Tiers 1 and 2. It didn't work out that way. A bunch of stuff happened. The whole video ended up being more work than I wanted it to. My computer ran out of memory to make it not worth doing the whole 2 hours in one go. So you're probably gonna get tiers 2 and 3 next week or maybe the week after. I need a break from this tier list series because it's been killing. It sucks to make these. Oh my god. This tier list has just been really difficult to work on. I need a better balance when making them, because it just kind of overwhelms anything else I do and prevents me from actually enjoying things while I make it. We'll see how we go into the other tiers. Oh yeah, if you want more after the next part, you're gonna have to do some sharing of the video, because if this effort does not get the if this effort does not perform well enough, I'll release an updated version of the tier list to my website, but that's all I'm getting from that. It's not worth it to make myself miserable for something no one cares about. I got depressing. Alright, well, thanks everyone for watching. Stay tuned for the next part of this. Please subscribe. That really tells me you want more of these. Probably going to be some other smaller videos released as well. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.